Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be focusing on war, and that's something that can afflict literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world. Our guest today is an expert on this and how we can look at other solutions rather than war. David Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is executive director of World Beyond War and the campaign coordinator of rootsaction.org. Mr. Swanson's books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. David Swanson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being back again. It's been years since we've done this, and a lot has transpired. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, but anyway, let's before we go too far, I want to put in a plug for your www.rootsaction.org website, so our viewers can go to that and take a look at it. And let's just jump into your first book. Not the first one you wrote, but the one I got on my list here, War is a Lie. What was the main message behind that?
Well, I do think it was the first book I wrote. I've written
Great.
a lot of other ones since then, but needless to say, the idea was not that wars don't exist or some such nonsense, but that virtually everything people tell each other about wars, and in particular to justify wars, is not true. The general assumption is that, well, if the government's fighting a war, there must be some good reason. And the actual understanding, after going through all the chapters of the book, ought to be that if there is a war, somebody's been lied to. A war based on lies is just a long-winded way of saying a war, because they're all based on lies. And as long as the war machine keeps wasting trillions of dollars every year and destroying the environment and risking going nuclear, war impacts every single living thing on the planet.
Mm-hmm. One of the most atrocious examples, and unfortunately, it proves exactly what you said, was the Iraq War, and how the American public, the UN, members of Congress, the world in general, was misled by this bogus information. Well, those lies come right down to it. And many of the people who lied knew they were not telling the truth at the time. How did propaganda play a role in us getting into that boondoggle, which has now cost, I think, over $3 trillion? We've had over 5,000 American troops killed, not to mention millions of Iraqis. But how did that, I say millions, but maybe off a little bit on that, but how did propaganda and the media compliance play into it?
Absolutely essential. As with most recent wars, you couldn't do it without corporate media bowing and scraping to the propagandists in the War Department and the White House and the Congress. It's absolutely critical. And of course, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and gang are now, revered elders and portrait painters and so forth. And Tony Blair is being proposed as a colonial viceroy for Palestine. These are people who ought to be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, just as Benjamin Netanyahu and others are facing prosecution should anyone have the decency to execute their arrest warrants. But when I say wars can be based on lies, absolutely every single person on earth raises their hand and says the Iraq War, and my point is that the Iraq War was not unlike any other war, every single other war in this regard. The liars were just not as skillful. They were just not very good liars. They picked very stupid and easily disproven lies, and they almost openly told their lies. And so you'll find people who say, oh, yeah, the Iraq War was based on lies. Oh, yeah, 85 recent wars were based on lies, but there's one somewhere, and it's almost always World War II was somehow or other not based on lies, and therefore it's okay to have all these other evil wars because there was that one time that wasn't based on lies. And so my point is, no, that's absolutely wrong. You can't have a war without the lies.
Well, let's pick a spot. And before we get off George W. Bush and Tony Blair had really a sort of a sterling reputation until he agreed to co-sponsor the war in Iraq. Had he not agreed, the U.S. probably would not have gone into Iraq. That's what some of the experts say. I don't know if it's true or if it's not true, but his reputation is totally blemished. George W. Bush, a lot of people think he should be on trial as a war criminal, along with Dick Cheney and a few other people, and which is absolutely true. But let's focus on one area, like Ukraine. Here we saw the Russians basically violated international law. They came across the Ukrainian border, illegally invaded Ukraine. Literally hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people have been killed. That horrible conflict's going on for 3 years. What could have been done if the UN Security Council was about the only one I think that could have stopped it or helped stop it? And then when you have Russia as one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, that wasn't going to happen. Russia would have vetoed any Security Council resolution. But what could have happened to short circuit that illegal act of a war? And I know there were provocations as to why Russia thought it was being threatened by NATO and all of that. But is there anything that could have been done to have prevented this?
Well, you want me to answer what should be done after it happens and what should be done to prevent it, but not mention the provocations. And so, as I'm left with very little.
Let's do all three. Let's do all three.
But I mean, as everyone is, everyone I know is demanding that the governments of the world right now override the U.S. veto in the Security Council on all things related to Israel and Palestine and use a measure called Uniting for Peace. I mean, that ought to be the norm. The General Assembly ought to have the courage and decency to override a veto in the Security Council as a matter of routine. And so that could be done with a Russian veto, as with a U.S. veto. The people of the world could decide to democratize the United Nations. That being said, either the Russian side or the U.S./NATO side could have behaved better for weeks, months, years, and decades leading up to the crisis in Ukraine, which was dramatically escalated on the day everyone likes to look to by Russia. And of course, shortly after that, there was a ceasefire pretty well agreed to by all sides in Turkey. And the UK and the US said, no, you cannot do that. You must continue the war. And Ukraine saluted and continued the war. But even just before the big Russian invasion, Russia's demands were perfectly reasonable. And the United States had no interest in considering them whatsoever. Russia only understands violence. The fact that their demands are more reasonable than ours were in the Cuban Missile Crisis is neither here nor there. We won't talk to them. And the Minsk II agreements were essentially better than any agreement anybody's going to get now. And nobody wanted to uphold them. And the French and German governments have openly said they were just pretending. They were just buying time for Ukraine to arm itself. And of course, for years prior to the Russian invasion, there was warfare in eastern Ukraine. And we're supposed to somehow pretend that wasn't there. And, geniuses are now saying, well, if Ukraine had just kept nuclear weapons, it would be okay. No, but it was putting nuclear capable missile bases in Romania and Poland that were chief among the provocations we shouldn't mention. And it's not just me. It's the Secretary General of NATO at the time of the Russian invasion said this is because of NATO expansion and Russia not wanting more NATO expansion. So it would not have been difficult at all for either side or the international community to have prevented this war or to end it now.
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, before we go into end it now, which I'm very interested in, bring me up to date a little bit on some of the provisions of the Minsk agreement. What exactly did the Russians want, or what was included in the Minsk agreement?
Well, this was an agreement basically to keep Ukraine as a nation and a more or less neutral nation, not a part of a Russian empire or a NATO empire, but a neutral country with sovereignty, but with a great deal of autonomy for its eastern provinces, much the way that U.S. states are, at least when Trump isn't in office, allowed to do a lot of the governing at the state level. And this was not something that the Ukrainian uh, government was much inclined, at least certain elements of it, to go along with. And that the European partners that signed onto this agreement had no interest in trying to uphold it. And in fact, you pretty soon had warfare in eastern Ukraine, with the majority of it coming from the West, from the Ukrainian government. And so, it's when I say it would be easy to make peace now, I mean, this is a little extreme. Nothing's easy, and there's a lot less trust available on either side. So it would take demonstrable actions to make peace at this point.
It certainly would, but we've got to keep trying. And I'm going to come back in just a moment. We're going to come back and we'll see if we can come up with a solution for this. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. If you are involved with a PBS or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at war, and we certainly have quite a few of them going on around the world. And my guest is an expert on war and how we can prevent them in many cases. David Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He's executive director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator at rootsaction.org. Mr. Swanson's books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. David, what is the solution to Ukraine? We're in a mess. A lot of things should not have been done. What can we do to get out of this, to alleviate the suffering and to hopefully prevent future conflicts in that area?
I mean, the solution is to move in the direction of where Ukraine was a decade or two back, and have neither side pushing to make it part of their empire. The solution obviously was not to elect some buffoon who promised to end the war by his own inauguration day when he had no notion and still has exhibited not a single sign of any inclination to have a clue as to how to do it. I mean, it's like Nixon's secret plan for peace in Vietnam, and it's still secret to this day. There was no plan. There was no notion of what to do. And so Trump came in and said, well, whatever Russia wants. And then after months of that, he said, well, whatever Ukraine wants. No, this doesn't work. This doesn't help. We need a willingness to compromise. We need on both sides a willingness to say, no, actually compromise would be preferable to destroying the world or even just continuing another year of slaughter. When I would say this a couple of years back, people would scream at me, how dare you? You don't live in Ukraine. Look at the polling of the people in Ukraine, which was always rather dubious. How many people had fled? How many people could honestly say what they thought? But now the polling in Ukraine is overwhelmingly in favor of negotiated, compromised settlement instead of continuing this war with, demands for all wishes of Ukraine before we'll even go to the table. And they're right. It takes people some years, but they eventually catch on that war doesn't work. And so we don't just need a compromise, though, between what Russia wants and what the U.S. wants. We need some consideration of what the people in the separate provinces of Ukraine want. And it's trickier and messier than ever because people have been moved in and out, and nobody believes anybody else. So you got to put some of these local decisions off and then have the decisions verifiable to all parties some years down the road. But you've got to start with neutrality and disarmament, and a backing off from both imperial contenders.
That is absolutely critical, and you have to have a dialogue. You can't stop talking to people. If you do, nothing positive is going to come out of it. That's for sure. Absolutely nothing. Well, it was fascinating. I know you've written several books, and one I wanted to get to is you had one says 5 questions to ask yourself before supporting any use of any military. What are the 5 questions?
Well, this is not a book, but an article that I
Oh, an
wrote
article.
the other day. That's very short. It's just 5 questions, and it's on davidswanson.org and other websites. And it came out of my concern that a lot of people I know and respect and have worked with for peace for many years have been demanding that the UN militarily intervene in Gaza, or that militaries accompany human aid flotillas to Gaza. And I've tried to say, no, no, no. We don't want the war machine to save the peace movement. This is not going to help things. Think a little more seriously before you support these ideas. And so the 5 questions that I suggested that people ask themselves, one is, would it be worth this short-term solution that you think you've got? Would it be worth what you're doing in the long term to support the war machine? Meaning you're discarding alternatives to using militaries, and in so doing, you're supporting the biggest impediment to global cooperation, the single biggest waste of badly needed resources, the single biggest destroyer of the natural environment, the cause of the nuclear threat, the justification for government secrecy and surveillance, and on and on and on. The problems with the war machine. Number two, doesn't the evidence show that a nonviolent approach would be more likely to succeed? And I think the evidence does. Number three, is it worth the damage and destruction and killing and what it would do to you to have supported such evil for an unlikely victory that's likely to be very short-lived? Number four, are you sure that pride and machismo and anger and resentment and frustration are not making you imagine something's a good idea when it's actually a very bad idea? And number five, are you sure you're not giving the other side exactly what it wants? Giving Israel exactly what it wants by shooting missiles at it, giving Trump exactly what he wants by attacking his troops in U.S. cities, giving NATO exactly what it wants by invading Ukraine, etc. Are you sure you're not being played for a sucker by the weapons dealers that might be arming your side and the other side at the same time? So answer those 5 questions and then tell me that I should support any military doing anything.
You should send a copy of that article to every leader in the world and every parliament, every Congress in the world, because usually when the saber rattling starts, they don't think about these things. All you do is you have the war machine cranking up. You know, we know who they are. About 8 companies that make billions, if not trillions, off of this war machine. And a lot of the corporations are involved in this, and they have no interest whatsoever in determining the truth. They're trying to identify a peaceful way out of it. Well, there's a document that's been used, I guess, since James Monroe came up with the Monroe Doctrine. Is that correct? And said that basically that Latin America was our backyard, and we would enforce. You couldn't intervene into our backyard, and the United States would take care of whatever. That has been used. In fact, I think it was used a lot during the bad old days of gunboat diplomacy, when the U.S. was roaming up and down the coast and sending in gunboats into Haiti and the Dominican Republic and wherever it might be to enforce our rule in those countries. But the Monroe Doctrine as I read it, was simply a doctrine by the Congress, I guess signed by the president. It really has no force of law, international law at all, does it? I mean, is it really worth the paper it's written on, except for sheer brute military force? Or if you can negotiate a country into doing what you want it to do?
No, the Monroe Doctrine is not a law. It was not a piece of legislation in Congress. It was and is a selection of excerpts from a speech that was made by a U.S. president, and a lot of the credit or shame for those words is given to his Secretary of State and President to be John Quincy Adams. But what James Monroe said included that the United States was in charge of the entire hemisphere and would, use its military to prevent European empires from interfering in the hemisphere. This, packaged as benevolent protection of our rising little democratic brothers and sisters to the south. And of course, the thing has been used and abused and modified and exaggerated for many decades now, as has the practice that came out of it of picking the worst, most belligerent thing each president ever said and making it their doctrine. So every president has a doctrine. And typically, and some of the doctrines have been invented by newspaper columnists before the president ever heard of them. And none of them, I think, have anything to do with laws. And just about all of them are the very worst thing that pundits and reporters could find in the words of that president and carve into stone as a doctrine. But they're not law. And in fact, it's a violation of serious laws to maintain that the United States can do what it wants in other countries that cannot do what they want in the United States. And for Donald Trump to blow up fishing boats, Venezuelan boats off the coast of Venezuela, over 1,000 miles from the United States, and say, well, Venezuela had the effrontery to be in the zone that the Southern Command is responsible for. Well, the Southern Command is just a portion of the U.S. military that's been called the Southern Command and declared itself in charge of the southern part of the Western Hemisphere. There's nothing legal about it whatsoever. And for the Nobel Committee to give a Nobel Peace Prize to a cheerleader for deadly sanctions and a military invasion of her own country, to give the prize not to Donald Trump, but to his next war, is outrageous. And we're going to see some bad consequences.
That would be Maria Machado, who got the Nobel Peace Prize, which President Trump wanted that also. But I'm not sure he was ever in the running.
No,
well, it may have been. I don't know.
He's not their type of warmonger, but they came as close as they could to giving it to him.
Well, what proof has been provided? What evidence up to this point that those boats that were eliminated were actually cartel boats, were drug runners, and that type of thing? I have not seen it. Have you? I don't know. It may be out there. I have no idea, but I've not seen anything. We're getting into this stage where they just say something like the president says Portland's burning to the ground. No, it's not. It's not even close. You got one little building that's being picketed, and that's it.
Well,
we're moving away from facts to take my word for it. Things, trust me, just trust me. But are we moving away from that?
And one of the things I point out in the book we mentioned earlier, War is a Lie, is that these are not just lies, but they're also answers to the wrong questions, right? I don't want to get into what proof might there be that one of these boats had something to do with some drug cartel, because what if it did? That doesn't justify, it doesn't legalize, doesn't moralize blowing up, murdering every occupant of a boat thousands of miles away, judge, jury, executioner, show your supposed evidence after the fact. There is nothing legal or acceptable about that. What if Portland did have a crime problem? There's still, what if it wasn't a bunch of nonsense based on Trump seeing videos from 5 years ago on Fox News that they pretended were from this week? What if those were current videos? Nothing would justify sending the US military into Portland to supposedly enforce the law and fight crime. It's not legal, it's not moral, it's not effective, it's not acceptable. It's dictatorial and brutal and outrageous. And so they like for us to spend our time answering the questions correctly that they've given these dishonest answers to. Does Iraq have WMDs? How many hours did we spend proving that Iraq did not have WMDs? Well, what if it did? The United States is chock full of WMDs. Nobody has the right to bomb us, so it's always the wrong question as well.
Exactly. And we're not even talking about due process, which is extremely important, nor evidentiary proof, nor international law and domestic laws. We're just totally overlooking all of them. Well, David, I can't believe it. Well, we're just about out of time. The last minute and a half. What closing message would you have for our viewers in the U.S. and around the world?
We got to step it up. This is, a question of survival, not a luxury. We got to recognize that peace is yet to come in Palestine, in Ukraine, and everywhere else. And people in the United States need to understand what they're witnessing. The problem with the military in U.S. cities is not that these, armed killers should be occupying the streets of somebody else's cities far away. It's that should never happen anywhere on Earth. And we've been given a golden opportunity to see it happening here in our cities in the United States, get a small glimpse of what it is, and say no to it here and everywhere. So yeah, I'm at rootsaction.org and worldbeyondwar.org and davidswanson.org.
Okay, very good. And if anybody ever wants to know what war is like, talk to some military people who have been in it, some people who have lost limbs, or in the United States, you can watch reruns of MASH, which are quite poignant, and they talk about the Korean War. But David Swanson, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much, Bill. My pleasure.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.